it was my experience that Mr. Trump inflated his total assets when it served his purposes, such as trying to be listed amongst the wealthiest people in Forbes, and deflated his assets to reduce his real estate taxes.
Follow the money. It's one of the oldest rules of the road for understanding any investigation into fraud or corruption. And when it comes to Donald Trump, it's proving fertile ground. The Washington Post out with a blockbuster new report today on Donald Trump's practice of inflating and exaggerating his wealth. Quote, when Donald Trump wanted to make a good impression on a lender, a business partner, or a journalist, he sometimes sent them official-looking documents called statements of financial condition. These documents sometimes ran up to 20 pages. They were full of numbers laying out Trump's properties, debts, and multi-billion-dollar net worth. But for someone trying to get a true picture of Trump's net worth, the documents were deeply flawed. Some simply omitted properties that carried big debts, some assets were overvalued, and some key numbers were wrong. Here's the kind of key numbers we're talking about. Trump at one point added 10 stories on top of Trump Tower. He said there were 68 floors when there are, in fact, 58. He slapped an extra 800 acres onto his winery in Virginia, and his financial statements in 2011 exaggerated the number of home lots ready to sell at his golf course in Southern California by 24. Joining our conversations are Lena Maxwell, SiriusXM Director of Progressive Programming, and Rick Stengel, former Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy. We're also going to add Washington Post political reporter David Fahrenthold with this blockbuster report we've been telling you about. David, it seems that, and this is just a political note, if you have any thoughts, I'm eager to hear them. Whenever the president seems to get himself into the clear with a pivot or a stroke of fate in one investigative front, a bombshell comes clapping back down on him in another, and your story is a perfect example of that.
Well, it's kind of a product of the fact that so many areas of the president's life are now under investigation, right? The Mueller investigation got a lot of ink, it got a lot of press, but it was only one of many. Right now, Trump's business, his charity, his inaugural committee, his transition, basically every organization he's led through his adult life is now under investigation all at the same time. So the end of the Mueller investigation takes away one little piece of that, but a lot more is going on. It's such a good reminder, and I wonder if you can just take us through exactly what you are reporting today. Well, we focus on these documents called Statements of Financial Condition, and the reason we care about them is that they seem to be in the middle of inquiries right now on Capitol Hill and also in New York State that both stem out of what Michael Cohen said, and you played some of that tape earlier. Cohen said that Trump would send these statements out to potential lenders, to his insurers, basically to say, look, I'm a rich guy. This was a written down, official-looking version of a brag. I'm so rich, you should do business with me. You should give me money. And there's rules about what you can say to your lenders and what you can say to your insurers and how far you can mislead them. And these documents were, in many cases, they seem misleading. As you said, they have wrong figures, they have exaggerations, they give an incorrect or inaccurate picture of how wealthy Trump was. David, I'm always curious and sort of keeping an unofficial tally about how many crimes he's protected from being treated like you or I would be treated because he's president. Is this another investigation where the office of the president could insulate him, or does he have more exposure here? He could have more exposure here. These are things that happened before he took office. There's always this question of whether a president can be indicted, a president can be sued in state court. But we're a long way from knowing if he really has criminal liability here. There's a lot of questions to be asked, like, did Deutsche Bank, did his insurers actually take action as a result of these misrepresentations? Was it enough to really move the needle and give him some benefit he wouldn't have gotten otherwise? Until we know that, until we see the full picture, it's hard to know what kind of exposure he has here. And is it a safe assumption that the documents that you saw that corroborate your reporting are in the hands of congressional investigators? Yes, they are. And congressional investigators are trying to get a lot more. So we have these documents for the years 2011, 2012, and 2013. Yesterday, it was revealed that the House Oversight Committee has asked Trump's accountants, the firm called Mazars USA, they've asked Trump's accountants to produce these documents over the last 10 years, as well as all the documents they relied on to produce them. So Congress wants a much bigger picture than what we've got right now. You know, Mimi, it's maybe the less sexy end of this investigation. Nothing called a dossier or nothing that's out of a spy novel. But it feels like a tortoise and a hare kind of dynamic, and it may be. David does this meticulous document-based reporting around
around these cases that, as he just said, are very much on the radar of Congress and represent a very real threat to this president.
Absolutely. I mean, look, in some ways, right, this is the bread and butter of what prosecutors at the federal and state level do. I mean, you know, we refer to them in federal prosecutors' offices anyway as fraudsters, people who serially inflate assets, misrepresent their assets, make false statements to heavily regulated industries like banks and mortgage lenders and insurance companies. Now, I'm not saying that right now he could be charged with, or that there is enough to say he committed a crime. We don't know. But boy, this really gives you, you know, it's not digging for a needle in a haystack. It's more like shooting fish in a barrel. And, you know, I've said this before, and I'll keep saying it, Donald Trump led his life not as someone who was expecting to be under a very strong microscope in the form of the Southern District of New York, the New York Attorney General's office, and many other, you know, prosecutors' offices. And that's going to catch up with him, and it should. There are people in prison right now. I mean, Paul Manafort is just one example, and a high-profile one. And frankly, he's on the extreme version. I mean, I think he was, you know, more of a career fraudster. But people go to jail for this stuff every day. And if it can be shown that he tried to get people to rely on these false statements in the form of, you know, making money, getting money to him, getting something out of it, whether or not they actually gave it to him, but that he was trying to get them to rely on it, you know, there's like a whole series of criminal statutes that could apply.
Making fraud great again.
I'm going to make a different point about it. In the 1980s, it was said of Henry Kissinger, he doesn't lie because it's in his interest, he lies because it's in his nature. That is Donald Trump. He lies about everything. He has corrupt intent about everything. So yes, why does he have to make Trump tower 10 stories higher? Because he has to say he's 6'3" instead of 6'2". This is part of the reason, and I'm going to do a little bit of a dogleg here, why the Mueller report was unable to come up with the collusion. I know I've been on the show and talked a lot in the past about collusion was going to be hard to prove. They all had corrupt intent, both sides. The problem was they were inept and incompetent. Both sides wanted the same thing, but they couldn't be coordinated. And remember, even Mueller in his report says that coordination wasn't established because they're uncoordinated. It's a corrupt organization. They're incompetent. The Russians, who I dealt with a lot, are just not able to do these things. Even that story that came out the other day or yesterday, that when Mueller indicted the 13 people from the Internet Research Agency, they came to America, and a couple of them said, "Hey, maybe we should go to purple states. Somebody told us that." That was a great revelation for the Russians. The Russians are incompetent. The Trump people are incompetent. Both people lie. That's why it's hard to establish collusion.
So Eli shouldn't worry about learning Russian to survive in Trump's America?
Well, I don't know if you have to learn Russian, but I mean, Rick is right about this, and it's a prism. You can look at all the stuff with Trump through this prism of the lying.
The incompetence defense.
And the incompetence also. Yeah, I think so.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.